It's been really enjoyable. It was great to have half an hour of informal interaction with a lot of the students at the Congress before my lecture. It was wonderful to be able to just have almost a careers session for half an hour, be able to say a bit about who I am, what I do, how I got into working with refugees, and the question of migration. And there were some really great questions that came from the audience. So it was a wonderful space in which I was able to just share some experiences, answer some questions, and great to have a sort of meet the speaker event before the lecture. Yeah, it's really challenging. I mean, I think the first thing about where we are going with Brexit depends very much on the strategy adopted by the British government. And at the moment, there's a real debate about that. It seems to me that in Theresa May laying out a Brexit is Brexit position, she's going towards what's been seen as a hard Brexit. Now, the hard Brexit versus soft Brexit, I think, is a very stark dichotomy. In reality, there are lots of positions of nuance in between that. But my feeling is we've sort of ruled out, sort of prematurely, some potential positions, like having the sort of Norwegian model or the Swiss model, where we might have part of the customs union or be part of the free trade area. And so it's going to be a really protracted set of negotiations. We're going to have to go through all of the text and all of the legal areas, unravel them, dismantle them, and anything we want to build in place to create new relationships with the European Union is going to have to be negotiated from scratch. So we're going to have to build a trade agreement with the EU on the back of a very delicate and problematic political relationship that will come from our withdrawal.
So do you think that the government sort of led to a harder discussion, so a harder debate on what kind of deal they were going to get?
I think immediately after Brexit, Theresa May's rhetoric has been to try to honour the referendum. And honouring the referendum has been understood to be complete exit from the European Union and then to renegotiate a trade deal on the basis of a blank slate. And I think there's a danger that that rejects a whole range of positions that could be in the national interest, good for the British economy, good for the European economy. And that's one of the reasons why I think there's still a degree of volatility in currency markets. Yes, we haven't seen big dramatic impacts on jobs, on inflation, on growth forecasts yet. That's partly because we haven't left. But we've seen volatility in the financial markets because investors and businesses want to know whether they will be able to buy and sell and import labour backwards and forwards. And at the moment, it seems like we will have to negotiate all that from scratch.
And do you reckon Theresa May had to do that because of her position before she was actually elected, or are there any kind of motivation in your opinion?
Well, she's had a bit of a U-turn because she supported the Cameron position of Remain,
naturally,
and then she became Prime Minister and shifted the position. And I think she's a political pragmatist who has changed from being on the Remain side to on the Brexit side, justified by a sense that that is the will of the British people. It's something that caters to a certain media perspective, but it's quite dangerous because it sees almost the decision in a referendum as the sum total of how democracy works. Direct democracy is not the same as representative democracy. And so she didn't leave much room for the role of the Supreme Court, for instance, the role of the judiciary, the role of the House of Lords. She sought to limit the scope for MPs in Parliament to debate the outcome of the referendum and insisted Brexit will mean Brexit. So I think it's politically astute, and the Conservative Party is benefiting from being seen to honour the referendum, but I'm not convinced it's in our national economic interest to rule out so many possibilities for the relationship with the EU. It's a great question. It depends how we understand democracy. And I think Britain has very limited experience of direct democracy. Other areas like Switzerland or California have many referenda. They put a lot of issues to the electorate. We don't tend to do that. And I think having a referendum against the backdrop of limited cultural experience of referenda meant that there was an assumption that it would be not an advisory referendum, but something that in itself would be determining. And that's not the constitutional case. Once you've made that decision, it still has to go through Parliament, it still has to go through courts, it still has to go through the House of Commons, but also the House of Lords. And the assumption has been that scrutiny by those elements of truly representative democracy, with all its checks and balances, were no longer relevant somehow. And that's a complete misunderstanding of democracy and a subversion of key elements of what representative democracy should look like. It may be that honouring Brexit is democratic, but it's democratic insofar as it's also subject to those other political mechanisms.
And naturally, in terms of democracy, we have to listen to the voices of all the people, right? But we know that the vast majority of young voters voted to remain, and which would be the people that are actually going to be more affected, so to speak, by the actual Brexit. So do you think they should have weighted the votes, sort of?
I don't think you weight votes in democracy, but I think there's a real intergenerational challenge, and I think it's very striking that age was one of the main splits in the vote, that predominantly young voters wanted to remain, older voters wanted to leave, albeit that there was a lower voter turnout from younger voters. And that reveals something that I think applies across many areas of public policy, a difference between the position of the baby boomers, the people who benefited from the growth in the economy through the 1960s, 70s and 80s, and a new generation, which increasingly includes the millennials, that find it harder to get jobs, find it harder to buy houses, feel alienated by the pulling up the drawbridge nativism of the older generation. How we reconcile the potential intergenerational clash is a real political challenge. It's not a case of weighting one group's votes higher than another. It has to be a case of dialogue, understanding, consensus, and government policy ensuring that it empowers the younger generation, recognising that it's in many ways, despite technology, despite huge opportunity, despite the internet, it's a very hard thing to be in your 20s or your early 30s and not be able to get a mortgage, to find jobs markets very difficult to navigate, to be coming out of university with a degree but not necessarily the same prospects of people who are now in their 40s, 50s and 60s.
Do you reckon Brexit will sort of fill that intergenerational challenge, or would it broaden it even more?
I think a real cleavage has opened up intergenerationally by revealing that division in the vote. I think many baby boomers are feeling very defensive. They're feeling that they want to preserve a Britain they know. They feel threatened by globalisation. They may not travel as much. They may not interact with the migrant population as much. Whereas there's a very globalised, tech-savvy younger generation aspiring to travel, having friends from other countries, being internationally oriented, that feels they don't belong in the country of that older generation. Now, I'm obviously caricaturing. There are younger people who, for sometimes valid reasons, believed in Brexit. There are many older people who are very pro-European. But I think there are divisions that need to be healed and public policies that need to manage the shift in opportunities that are available, and potentially a redistribution in certain aspects of opportunity in certain parts of income and wealth back across the generations through social policies like education, job access, better housing policies. Yeah, absolutely. I think the challenge, of course, is always vested interests. If you benefit from globalisation, you don't have much incentive to share the benefits. But I think now people who are part of that supposed global liberal elite, who engage in international trade, who travel, who are outward looking, recognise that to safeguard those benefits, they have to share them. And if they don't, the project will collapse under the weight of democratic pressures, the reassertion of sovereignty and nationalism. And so I think there's a real incentive to try and reconceive the globalisation project, to create mechanisms that acknowledge the realities. Migration is here to stay, trade is of value, the internet and technology are transformative, and that automation will undermine labour-intensive manufacturing jobs. We have to acknowledge that, we have to put it on the table, we have to be straightforward about that, socially but also at a political level, and then find ways in which we can create a different form of globalisation. Not a neoliberal model, but one that takes those aggregate benefits and makes all aspects of society benefit, including through better social services, better health opportunities, better education, and moves away from the kind of austerity measures that have eroded local communities, eroded a sense of community solidarity, and far from creating David Cameron's big society, has shrunk solidarity within our communities. Yeah, the European Union's in great peril as a project. The challenge to the European Union goes back to the financial crisis. The challenges that Greece faced really created a sense of, would Greece leave? Would it be expelled? There was a sense of gross injustice in the structural adjustment measures imposed from Berlin and from Brussels. And through the migrant crisis, there's been a failure to create collective action, a failure of cooperation, leading people to question what those institutions mean and how they uphold a better politics of cooperation. I think as we see the rise of far-right nationalist parties in the Netherlands, in Austria, in France, many of those far-right parties have in their rhetoric an anti-EU position. They are asserting that the European Union is acquiring too much subsidy, imposing rules on the nation state, and that we need to either reform it or disband it. The challenge for the European Union is it needs to be far less bureaucratic. At the moment it's perceived as a sort of Brussels bureaucracy. We have to ensure that it is seen as addressing people's day-to-day problems, that it's serving European electorates, not simply taking resources and being stuck in a bureaucratic mire and failing to deliver solutions. We also need politicians to be clearer and bolder in explaining why we have the European Union. Yes, it's for economic prosperity. Yes, it's a free trade area. Yes, it's about the free movement of goods, services, labour, capital, from which we all benefit. But as a starting point, it was a political project. And it was a political project to provide peace in Europe. It was built on never again, the idea that France and Germany had been to 2 world wars, and we needed to safeguard that. We can't take that for granted, but today, some 70 years after the Second World War, we are taking it for granted. And I think it's really important that politicians, if they want to defend the European Union, remind their electorates that it's about cooperation. It's not just economics, it's also about politics and peace.
So, following up on that, do you believe that if it was the case that the Remain side would have been, Remain campaign would have been more united and bolder in conveying its message, would the outcome of the referendum been different?
I think so. I think the Remain campaign was weak. The Brexit campaign was bold, clear, and challenged the status quo. It had a vision of transformation, one I disagree strongly with, but it had that vision. The Remain campaign had no vision of the future. It couldn't articulate why the European Union could meet people's day-to-day concerns. It couldn't articulate how it could be better and bolder. The Conservative Party campaigned on a very ambivalent basis. They said, yes, we want to stay in the European Union, it's pragmatic, it serves our economic concerns. They failed to put a strong pro-European case to the electorate, and they failed to explain the political benefits. The Labour Party was similarly weak. There was a lot of ambiguity. They were aware that a lot of their voters were sceptical about the European Union. They were concerned about UKIP getting votes in traditionally working class areas, taking votes from the Labour Party and undermining its core constituency. And that's why people like Jeremy Corbyn had very little influence in the referendum. They weren't coming out saying, we must stay in the European Union. They were coming out saying, we support Remain, we're not quite sure why, we see weaknesses in the European... It was wishy-washy and ambiguous. And on the other hand, the clear message came from the far right. The centre of politics collapsed and had no vision of why the European Union mattered. I think that's absolutely right, that politicians presenting a vision of change and transformation are much more credible and much more electable than status quo politicians. If you're simply representing a status quo from which people are alienated, whether as Hillary Clinton or as many of the Remain campaigners, it's much harder to make your message resonate than if you present a vision of change and transformation. And that's what the far right is managing to do. And that's why they're galvanising support across Europe and also the wider world. It's not just here, but it's also the Philippines, India, many parts of the world are developing a far right populist nationalism because it's clear messaging, it's understandable, and it's transformative. And to contest that, liberal centrist politicians have to articulate a vision of the future. There's nothing fundamentally incompatible between liberal European values and the presence of Muslims in Europe. Many Muslims have liberal, cosmopolitan values. Many Europeans have conservative values. We can create a tolerant, inclusive society. And in the past, we've integrated Muslim refugees and asylum seekers. In the 1990s, 800,000 Kosovar refugees came to Europe. Hundreds of thousands of Bosnians came to Europe. For the most part, they were Muslims. It just so happened it was prior to September the 11th, 2001, when Islam became politically toxic. So I think we need an honest debate that Islam, cultural diversity are questions that the far right is engaging with, but again, liberal and centrist politicians are failing to come up with a narrative to address. And I think we need to be honest. The sooner we're honest and have that debate, the sooner myths and distortions can be challenged, and we can show the conditions under which we welcome outsiders to come and live here according to our values, but also show that there's nothing threatening for the most part. There's no greater likelihood of refugees or asylum seekers statistically engaging in acts of terror than there is for the cross-section of the general population.